The moment he reduced her entire existence to a debt, something inside her didn't break. It changed. The ballroom shimmered under layers of calculated perfection. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble floors, reflecting wealth so excessive it felt almost unreal. Every detail of the evening had been engineered to impress, from the subtle orchestral music to the carefully curated guest list of elites who carried influence like a second identity. This was not just an event. It was a display of power. At the center of it all stood Adrian Voss. He did not move like other men in the room, where others laughed, gestured, or leaned into conversations. Adrian remained composed, still and deliberate. His presence did not demand attention. It commanded it without effort. People adjusted their posture when he walked past. Conversations shifted in tone. Even silence seemed to recognize him. He was not simply powerful. He was control in its most refined form. And standing just a few steps behind him, almost blending into the background by design, was Elara Quinn. She did not belong in that room, not in the way the others did. Her presence lacked the effortless entitlement that surrounded her. She carried herself with quiet restraint, her posture straight, but not relaxed, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. To an outsider, she might have appeared composed, even elegant, but beneath that stillness was something far more fragile and far more complex. She had learned how to exist without being seen. The event moved forward like a well-rehearsed performance. Conversations overlapped, glasses clinked, and carefully disguised negotiations unfolded behind polite smiles. Every interaction held weight. Every word carried intention. But none of it mattered as much as the unspoken hierarchy that defined the room, and Adrian stood at the very top of it. Elara's role in that hierarchy was simple. She was not a guest. She was not a partner. She was not even an equal. She was an obligation. The realization had settled into her long ago, but tonight, something about it felt sharper, more visible. The way people glanced at her, then quickly away. The way her presence was acknowledged, but never truly accepted. She existed within Adrian's world, but she was not part of it. She was attached to it. And then, without warning, the moment arrived. It did not begin with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It began quietly, almost casually, like most defining moments do. Adrian had been speaking with a small circle of influential figures, his tone measured, his expressions controlled. The conversation revolved around expansion, acquisitions, and strategic alliances, the language of power. Elara stood nearby, as she always did, close enough to be included, distant enough to be insignificant. At some point, the attention shifted. It wasn't clear what triggered it. Perhaps a question, perhaps a subtle remark. But suddenly, the focus of the group moved, not toward her directly, but toward the idea of her. And Adrian, without hesitation, clarified her position, not with anger, not with emotion, but with precision. He framed her existence in a way that stripped the complexity of humanity, of individuality. In a single calculated statement, he reduced her to something transactional, something owed, something managed, something owned. A debt. The word did not echo loudly, but it settled heavily in the space between them. It carried weight far beyond its simplicity. It erased everything she had been before this moment. It dismissed everything she had endured to stand there, and the room responded exactly as expected. No one challenged it. No one questioned it. No one intervened. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to notice. A few allowed faint, knowing expressions to pass across their faces, as if this revelation merely confirmed what they had already assumed. To them, it was not shocking. It was logical. Elara felt the shift instantly, not in the room, but within herself. The humiliation did not arrive as a sudden wave. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like something tightening around her. Every glance she avoided, every silence she maintained, added to the weight pressing against her chest. But she did not react. That was what made the moment different. In the past, something inside her would have fractured under this kind of exposure. Not visibly. She had always been too controlled for that. But internally, there would have been a quiet collapse, a retreat, a need to disappear. This time, there was no collapse. There was stillness. Her expression remained unchanged. Her posture did not falter. She did not step forward, and she did not step back. To everyone watching, she appeared exactly as she had moments before, composed, silent, contained. But inside, something had shifted in a way she could not fully explain. It was not strength. It was not anger. It was not even defiance. It was awareness. For the first time, she was not just experiencing humiliation. She was observing it, noticing the patterns, the reactions, the absence of resistance, the way power shaped perception so completely that truth became irrelevant. And more importantly, she was noticing him. Adrian did not look at her when he said it. That was the detail that lingered. He spoke about her as if she were already understood, already defined, already placed within the structure of his world. There was no hesitation in his tone, no need for validation. He did not need the room to agree. He simply needed them to accept. And they did, because he had taught them how. The realization settled quietly, but firmly. This was not just about control. This was about narrative. He had decided who she was. And everyone else had followed. For a brief moment, her gaze lifted, just slightly, just enough to take him in fully. The man who controlled rooms without raising his voice. The man who turned people into positions, roles, assets. The man who had shaped her life into something she no longer recognized as her own. But as she looked at him now, something felt incomplete, not wrong, incomplete. There was a precision to everything he did, but precision often required preparation, and preparation required intention. The more she thought about it, the less his control felt natural, and the more it felt constructed, carefully constructed. The thought passed quickly, almost too quickly to hold on to, but it left something behind. A question she had never allowed herself to ask before. Why her? The event continued as if nothing significant had happened. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned. Glasses were refilled. The moment dissolved into the rhythm of the evening, absorbed into the normalcy of power dynamics that no one dared to disrupt. But for Alara, it did not dissolve. It settled. Every detail replayed itself in her mind, not as pain, but as information. The tone of his voice, the reactions of the room, the absence of surprise, the ease with which her identity had been reduced to something so simple. A debt. The word no longer felt like an insult. It felt like a clue. She remained where she was for a few moments longer, allowing the environment to stabilize around her. Then, without drawing attention, she stepped away. Not abruptly, not noticeably, just enough to remove herself from the immediate circle of influence. No one stopped her. No one followed. She moved to the edge of the ballroom, past conversations that no longer registered, past faces that blurred into irrelevance. The noise of the event faded slightly, replaced by a quieter, more focused awareness. For the first time, she was not thinking about how to endure. She was thinking about how to understand. The difference was subtle, but it was everything. By the time she reached the far end of the room, the weight of the moment had transformed. It was no longer pressing down on her. It was pulling her forward, not toward escape, but toward something she had never considered before. Clarity. Behind her, Adrian remained exactly where he had been, at the center, untouched, unchallenged, in complete control of everything around him. But control, she realized, depended on something fragile. It depended on people not questioning it. And for the first time, she paused briefly, her gaze lowering again, not in submission, but in focus. The silence within her was no longer empty. It was forming, aligning, shifting into something sharper, something more deliberate, something dangerous. Because awareness, once awakened, could not be undone. And as the night continued, filled with elegance and illusion, one truth settled quietly into place. She was no longer just surviving his world. She was beginning to see it, and that meant, sooner or later, she would understand it. For the first time, she didn't feel powerless. She felt aware, and that changes everything. Long before he controlled her present, her past had already been quietly falling apart. Awareness did not arrive in isolation. It came with memory. As Alara stood at the edge of that carefully constructed world, her mind did not remain in the present for long. The clarity she had begun to feel pulled her backward, not gently, but with purpose, because understanding what Adrian Voss had turned her into required understanding who she had been before he ever existed in her life, and who she had been felt almost unfamiliar now. There was a time when her world had been simple, not easy, but honest. She had lived in a small, structured reality where effort still meant something, where hard work carried the promise of stability. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't powerful, but it was hers. Her father had built that belief into her from an early age, not through speeches or grand lessons, but through consistency. He worked tirelessly, holding on to routines that never changed, believing that stability was something you protected, not something you questioned. Her mother, quieter but equally strong, held everything else together. The emotional weight, the unspoken worries, the fragile balance of a life that never quite allowed room for mistakes. For a long time, that balance held, until it didn't. The collapse did not come all at once. It began subtly, almost invisibly. Small disruptions, delayed payments, conversations that ended too quickly, tension that lingered longer than it should have. At first, it felt manageable, something temporary, something that would pass. But instability has a way of spreading. What started as a financial strain quickly turned into something heavier. Debts accumulated faster than they could be addressed. Opportunities disappeared. Trust, once steady, began to erode. And the structure that had once felt reliable started to fracture under pressure. Ilera watched it happen in silence, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. She saw the way her father's confidence shifted into quiet desperation. She noticed the way her mother stopped asking certain questions, as if avoiding them could somehow delay reality. She felt the weight of unspoken fear settling into every corner of their home. And slowly, without anyone explicitly saying it, the responsibility began to shift. Toward her, it wasn't immediate, it wasn't declared, but it was clear. She was the one who adapted first, the one who stopped expecting things to improve and started preparing for what came next. She adjusted her ambitions, narrowed her focus, and began making choices not based on what she wanted, but on what was necessary. Dreams, once vivid and specific, became abstract, then irrelevant. She had wanted something different for herself, something independent, something earned on her own terms. But as the pressure around her increased, those ideas began to feel distant, almost unrealistic. Survival replaced ambition. Stability replaced identity. And she accepted it, not because she was weak, but because she was practical. That was the first thing she gave up, her future. The second came more quietly, her sense of self. As circumstances tightened, she became more controlled, more measured, more careful. Every decision carried weight. Every mistake felt amplified. There was no room for uncertainty, no space for exploration. She became exactly what the situation required: reliable, composed, and invisible when necessary. It worked for a while, but control, when force, comes at a cost. And the cost was her. The moment everything changed did not feel dramatic at the time. It did not come with a clear warning or a single defining event. It came as an opportunity, structured, precise, and presented as a solution. By then, her family situation had reached a point where options were no longer abundant. They were limited, urgent, and increasingly desperate. Every path forward carried risk, but standing still was no longer possible. That was when Adrian Voss entered her life. Not directly, not personally, but through something far more effective. A system. The offer, when it came, was positioned carefully. It did not appear as control. It appeared as relief, structured assistance, financial intervention, stability, restored through precise conditions. It was a kind of solution that felt almost too perfect, but perfection in moments of crisis is rarely questioned, because desperation does not analyze. It accepts. The terms were clear, even if they were not fully understood. Support would be provided, debts would be managed, stability would return. In exchange, there would be obligations, structured, defined, and binding. At the time, it felt like a transaction, manageable, necessary, temporary. What Ilera did not realize then was that the structure of that agreement was not designed for balance. It was designed for control. The transition into his world did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, step by step, each stage reinforcing the next. What began as assistance became expectation. What felt like support turned into dependency. And before she could fully process the shift, she was no longer navigating her own life. She was operating within someone else's system, Adrian's system. The realization came slowly. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that once the situation stabilized, she would step away, that this was just a phase, an uncomfortable but necessary chapter. But stability, she learned, can be engineered and never fully arrive. There was always another condition, another requirement, another adjustment that needed to be made before anything could truly be resolved. The finish line moved just enough to remain out of reach. And with every step forward, her ability to step away weakened, because dependency had already taken hold. The shift from independence to obligation is rarely obvious while it's happening. It disguises itself as progress, as responsibility, as maturity. But by the time it becomes visible, it is already deeply rooted. Illyria did not notice the exact moment she lost control. She only noticed when she no longer had it. Her days became structured around expectations she did not set. Her decisions aligned with outcomes she did not choose. Even her presence, where she stood, where she went, how she existed, was influenced by a system she had not designed. At the center of it all, whether visible or not, was Adrian Voss. He did not need to appear often. His influence was enough. Looking back, the signs had always been there. The precision of the offer, the timing of the intervention, the way every solution seemed to lead further into the same structure. It was too coordinated to be coincidence. But at the time, she had not questioned it, because she could not afford to. This was the truth that settled heavily within her now, as she stood on the edge of his world. Seeing it clearly for the first time, she had not chosen this life, but she had walked into it. Not freely, not blindly, but inevitably. And that inevitability was what disturbed her most, because inevitability suggests design. A single thought formed, sharper than anything she had allowed herself to consider before. What if this was never about helping her? The question lingered, refusing to fade. It changed the way she viewed everything. The offer, the structure, the control, even the man himself. What once felt like circumstance now felt intentional. What once seemed like misfortune now hinted at something far more calculated. And the more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to align. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to create doubt. Enough to create suspicion. Enough to make her question the foundation of everything she had accepted as reality. Because if her fall had not been accidental, then it had been engineered. The idea should have felt impossible, extreme, paranoid even, but instead, it felt disturbingly plausible. And that was what made it dangerous. Because once a possibility becomes believable, it cannot be ignored. Illyria's past, once something she had tried to move beyond, now demanded to be re-examined. Not emotionally, but analytically. Not as something that had happened to her, but as something that may have been shaped. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she was not just remembering her past. She was questioning it. And as that question settled into place, one realization followed quietly behind it. One she could not ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. Looking back, it no longer feels like coincidence. It feels like someone designed her fall. To the world, he was untouchable. But the closer she looked, the more unnatural his perfection felt. Once the question had formed in Illyria's mind, it refused to stay contained. It followed her into every space, every silence, every moment where observation replaced reaction. The idea that her past might not have been accidental changed the way she saw the present. And more importantly, it changed the way she saw him. Adrian Voss was no longer just a man who controlled her circumstances. He became something else, a pattern, and patterns, once noticed, are impossible to ignore. His empire was not built in a way that invited understanding. It was designed to impress, to dominate, and to discourage curiosity. From the outside, It appeared seamless, an interconnected network of businesses, investments, and influence that stretched across industries without visible strain. Everything functioned with precision, every outcome aligned with expectation. Every risk seemed accounted for before it even emerged. It was not just wealth. It was control disguised as success. Illyria began to notice how carefully everything was structured, the way information moved, filtered, deliberate, never excessive, the way people interacted within a system. Efficient, restrained, aware of invisible boundaries they never crossed. Even the smallest details felt calculated, as if randomness had been systematically removed. Nothing in his world was accidental. That realization settled heavily, because if nothing was accidental, then everything was intentional, and intention required design. She did not have direct access to the inner workings of his empire, but she didn't need it. The surface alone revealed enough. The consistency, the predictability, the absence of visible failure. It all pointed toward something deeper than ambition. It pointed toward control at a level that extended beyond business. Adrian did not build systems. He engineered outcomes. That was what made him different. Most powerful men relied on influence, negotiation, or leverage. Adrian operated on something far more precise. He positioned people. He shaped environments. He created conditions where outcomes became inevitable, not because they were forced, but because they were the only logical conclusion. It was a form of control that did not feel like control, and that was what made it effective. Illyria began to see it everywhere. The way meetings unfolded exactly as expected. The way decisions were made before they were formally discussed. The way resistance, when it appeared, dissolved quickly, not through confrontation, but through quiet redirection. He did not react to problems. He prevented them. Or, more accurately, he removed the possibility of them existing in the first place. This level of precision should have felt impressive. Instead, it felt unsettling, because perfection, when observed closely, often reveals something unnatural beneath it. And Adrian's perfection was too consistent to be organic. The more she observed him, the clearer his personality became, not through what he expressed, but through what he withheld. He did not display emotion in ways that felt spontaneous. His reactions were measured, controlled, and always aligned with the situation at hand. There was no excess, no unpredictability, no visible vulnerability. Even in moments that would provoke tension in others, he remained composed. Not calm, composed, as if every response had been pre-selected long before the moment required it. It created a distance that was difficult to define. He was present, but never fully accessible. Engaged, but never exposed. Everything about him suggested awareness, not just of his surroundings, but of himself, his image, and the impact he had on others. He was not just controlling situations. He was controlling perception, and that extended to the way he viewed people. Illyria had once believed that his attachment was simply part of his nature, a byproduct of power, perhaps, or the result of a life shaped by ambition. But now, with her awareness sharpened, she began to understand it differently. It was not detachment. It was classification. He did not see people as individuals with complexity or unpredictability. He saw them as variables, elements within a larger system, each with a function, a value, and a place. Their importance was not determined by who they were, but by what they contributed. And once their contribution was defined, their position became fixed. It explained everything: the way he interacted, the way he made decisions, the way he justified outcomes that others might question. To him, it was not personal. It was structural. And within that structure, Illyria had a role, not a choice, a role. The realization did not hurt in the way it once might have. It did not feel like rejection or dismissal. Instead, it felt clarifying, because once she understood how he viewed the world, his actions no longer felt unpredictable. They felt consistent. And consistency could be studied. But even within that consistency, there were moments, small, almost imperceptible, where something didn't align. Cracks, not obvious ones. Not flaws that could be easily identified or explained, but inconsistencies that lingered just long enough to be noticed. A hesitation that lasted a fraction longer than it should. A decision that, while logical, carried an undertone of something else. a shift in attention that didn't match the pattern she had begun to recognize. At first, she questioned whether she was imagining it, whether her growing suspicion was influencing her perception. But the more she paid attention, the more those subtle irregularities appeared, and each one pointed toward the same possibility. There was something in his past that did not fit the narrative he had constructed, something hidden, something unresolved. The idea did not come with evidence. Not yet, but it did not need to, because the absence of visible history, especially for someone as powerful as Adrian, was itself unusual. Information about him existed, but it felt curated, controlled, selective, as if certain parts had been removed, or never allowed to exist in the first place. That level of control over personal history required intention, and intention once again suggested design. Illyra's focus shifted subtly after that. She stopped looking at what was visible and started paying attention to what was missing. It changed everything, because absence, when examined closely, can reveal just as much as presence, and what was missing from Adrian's world began to feel more significant than what was there. At the same time, her awareness of her own position within that world became sharper. The boundaries that once felt abstract now appeared clearly defined. The limitations she had accepted without question now felt deliberate. Her movements were not restricted in obvious ways. She was not confined, not openly controlled. But there were patterns, subtle constraints that shaped her behavior without requiring direct enforcement. Access to certain information was limited. Interactions were filtered. Opportunities to step outside the structure were quietly redirected. It was control without visibility, and that made it far more effective, because it did not feel like control. It felt like reality. The more she recognized it, the more she understood how deeply embedded it was. Every aspect of her life within his system had been shaped to align with his expectations, not through force, but through design. And that realization carried a weight she could no longer ignore, because if her present was controlled and her past was possibly designed, then her entire life within the system was not a coincidence. It was a construct. The thought should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt focusing, because constructs, no matter how complex, have structure, and structure can be understood. For the first time, Illyra was not just reacting to her circumstances. She was analyzing them. The shift was subtle, but it marked the beginning of something irreversible. She began to move differently, not physically, but mentally, observing without drawing attention, processing without revealing, allowing herself to exist within the system while quietly stepping outside of it in thought. It was a dangerous position, because awareness, when hidden, creates imbalance, and imbalance, in a system built on control, does not go unnoticed for long. She did not realize when it happened. The moment was quiet, almost insignificant on the surface. A brief interaction, a passing glance. Nothing that would stand out to anyone else. But someone saw it. Not the full picture. Not the depth of her thoughts. But enough. Enough to recognize that something had changed. Within Adrian's inner circle, those who operated closest to him, who understood his systems more intimately than others, there were individuals who had learned to notice subtle shifts. They had to. In a world where control depended on precision, even the smallest deviation mattered. And Illyra, despite her efforts, had deviated. It was not obvious, but it was there, a difference in the way she observed, a stillness that no longer felt passive, a presence that carried awareness instead of submission. It was enough. Across the room, unnoticed by most, a single individual registered the change, not with alarm, not with immediate reaction, but with recognition. And recognition, in a world like this, was never neutral. Illyra felt it a moment later, not as a direct acknowledgement, but as a shift in the atmosphere around her. The subtle awareness of being seen, not superficially, but accurately. Her gaze moved, carefully controlled, until it met his. The man did not approach her. He did not speak. His expression remained neutral, his posture unchanged. To anyone else, he was simply another figure within the structure, but his eyes held something different, understanding, and something else, warning. It lasted only a second, a brief, silent exchange that carried more weight than any conversation could have. No words were needed. None would have been safe, because in that moment, a message was delivered with absolute clarity. She was no longer unnoticed, and whatever she had begun to uncover, she was not the only one aware of it. Someone close to him notices her curiosity and silently warns her without words. The truth didn't come looking for her. She stumbled into it by accident, and it changed everything. The warning lingered longer than the moment itself. It did not come with sound or explanation or visible urgency, but it settled into Alara's awareness with a clarity she could not ignore. Someone had noticed. Someone understood that her silence was no longer passive. And more importantly, someone believed that what she was approaching was dangerous enough to warn her, without ever saying a word. That realization should have stopped her. It didn't. If anything, it sharpened her focus. Because warnings, when unspoken, often carry a deeper truth than direct threats. They suggest not just risk, but knowledge. And knowledge, especially in a system as controlled as Adrian's, was never distributed carelessly, which meant one thing. There was something real to find. Alara did not act immediately. That would have been a mistake. Whatever she was stepping into required precision, not urgency. She maintained her routine, her composure, her carefully constructed invisibility. From the outside, nothing about her behavior suggested change. But internally, everything had shifted. She began to observe with intention, not broadly, but selectively. Instead of trying to understand the entire system, she focused on fragments, small details, overlooked patterns, the kind of information that existed quietly beneath the surface, unnoticed by those who had no reason to question it. And for a while, nothing happened. Days passed without confirmation, without discovery, without anything that justified the growing certainty inside her. It would have been easy to assume that her suspicions were misplaced, that the sense of design she felt was nothing more than coincidence shaped by pressure. But something in her refused that conclusion, because the structure around her was too precise, too consistent, too controlled. And control, when maintained at that level, always leaves traces. She found the first one by accident. It was not hidden in a way that suggested importance. In fact, it was the opposite. It was placed within a system so ordinary, so routine, that it did not invite attention. A set of financial summaries. Nothing unusual on the surface. Standard documentation. Predictable formatting. The kind of information that existed everywhere within Adrian's empire. But there was something about it. Not obvious. Not immediately definable. Just slightly misaligned. Alara paused on it longer than she should have. Not because she understood it, but because she didn't. And in a world built on precision, inconsistency becomes visible quickly. She reviewed it again, and then again. At first glance, everything appeared correct. The numbers aligned. The structure held. The documentation was complete. But the deeper she looked, the more subtle the irregularity became. It wasn't in what was present. It was in what was repeated. A pattern. Specific entries appearing across multiple records, linked not by category, but by timing. Small transfers. Insignificant amounts in isolation, but consistent in frequency. Controlled in distribution. Deliberate. The realization did not come as a shock. It came as recognition. Because this was how Adrian's system worked. Not through obvious actions, but through patterns that only became visible when viewed from the right perspective. Alara didn't move immediately. She didn't access more files or attempt to trace the entries further. That would have been too direct. Instead, she stepped back, mentally, not physically, and allowed the information to settle. Because understanding a pattern requires distance. And distance reveals connections. Over the next few days, she adjusted her focus. Not searching, but noticing, observing how similar structures appeared in different areas, how information repeated itself in subtle variations, how certain details aligned across systems that, on the surface, should have been independent, and slowly the pattern expanded. It was not just financial, it was structural, a network of controlled movements, resources, information, even people, positioned in ways that suggested coordination beyond standard operations. Nothing illegal in appearance. Nothing that could be immediately challenged. But too precise to be incidental. too consistent to be accidental. And then something changed. The pattern shifted direction. What had initially appeared as a network of external control began to turn inward. Connections that once pointed outward, to investments, to acquisitions, to expansions, started linking back towards something more specific, something personal. Illyria didn't recognize it at first. The connection was too subtle, too buried beneath layers of structured data. But once it appeared, even faintly, it became impossible to ignore, because it led to her, not directly, not obviously, but unmistakably, her past. Events she had once accepted as isolated, unrelated, and unavoidable began to align with the same pattern she had been observing: financial disruptions, timing inconsistencies, opportunities that appeared exactly when they were needed, but under conditions that led her deeper into dependency. At first, her mind resisted connection, not because it didn't make sense, but because it made too much sense. The idea that her life had been influenced, shaped, or even directed by the same system that now controlled her present was too precise to dismiss, and too disturbing to accept. Fear followed, not immediate panic, but a controlled, growing tension that settled into her chest and refused to leave, because this was no longer about observation. This was about implication. If the pattern was real, then her life had not simply changed. It had been guided. The thought alone was enough to destabilize everything she believed about her past. Every decision, every loss, every turning point. Suddenly, none of it felt entirely her own. But fear, she realized, was not useful. Not here, not now. Because fear leads to reaction, and reaction leads to exposure. Instead, she focused on clarity. She reviewed the connections again, this time more carefully, slower, more deliberately, not looking for confirmation, but for structure, for consistency, for anything that would either support or disprove what she was beginning to understand. And the more she looked, the clearer it became. This was not coincidence. This was design. Her emotional response shifted. Confusion gave way to focus. Disbelief gave way to analysis. And fear, while still present, became secondary. Because understanding, once it begins, demands completion. She could not stop now. Illyria adjusted her approach again, this time more strategically. She no longer followed patterns broadly. She narrowed her attention to specific points, moments in her past where change had occurred too precisely, too conveniently, too completely. And one by one, she traced them back, not through direct evidence, but through alignment, timing, structure, consistency. Each connection strengthened the same conclusion, until eventually, it was no longer a conclusion. It was a fact. Her life had been influenced long before she ever knew Adrian Voss existed, and the system that now controlled her present had been quietly shaping her path long before she stepped into it. The realization should have overwhelmed her. Instead, it grounded her, because for the first time, everything made sense. The offer that had arrived at exactly the right moment, the conditions that had seemed restrictive but necessary, the way every step forward had led her deeper into the same structure. None of it had been random. None of it had been unfortunate. It had been orchestrated. A single thought formed, clear, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. She had not been saved. She had been positioned. The weight of that truth settled into her slowly, but completely. It did not break her. It did not cause her panic or withdraw. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It stabilized her, because once you understand the structure around you, you stop being controlled by confusion and start being guided by clarity. But clarity comes with a cost, because once you see the truth, you cannot return to ignorance. And the truth, as Illyria now understood it, was far more complex than she had anticipated. This was not just about Adrian. This was about a system that had identified her, tracked her, and shaped her path long before she became aware of it. And if that was true, then there was still more she hadn't seen. More connections, more design, more truth waiting beneath the surface. The realization did not slow her down. It pushed her further, because if her past had been constructed, then the reason behind it still existed. And reasons, unlike systems, always leave a trace. Illyra's focus sharpened once more, narrowing toward the next layer, the one that had not yet revealed itself, but was now impossible to ignore, because whatever she had uncovered so far, it was only the beginning. And as the pieces continued to align, one final understanding settled into place. Quiet, precise, and impossible to deny. What she uncovers next makes one thing clear. Her suffering was never random. Fear had controlled her for too long. But this time, something stronger took its place. The delay had given her space, but not safety. Illyra understood that clearly. Whatever had disrupted Adrian's attention had not removed the threat. It had only postponed it. Systems like his did not lose focus permanently. They recalibrated, adapted, and returned more precise than before, which meant one thing. Time was no longer something she had. The awareness settled into her without panic. That was the difference now. Where fear once created hesitation, it now created clarity. She did not rush. She did not retreat. She adjusted, because survival had taught her how to endure. But understanding had taught her how to act. The next moment that shifted everything did not arrive as part of her plan. It came unexpectedly, uncontrolled, unscheduled, and impossible to ignore. Another exposure, not identical to the one before, but close enough. The setting was different, more contained, more private, but no less significant. A controlled environment where influence operated quietly, without the spectacle of public display. The kind of space where power did not need to prove itself. It simply existed. And within that space, Adrian once again defined her position. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with the same precision, the same reduction, the same controlled dismissal that framed her existence as something less than equal, less than independent, less than human. A debt. The word was not repeated exactly, but the meaning was. And this time, something different happened. Illyra did not feel the same weight, not because the moment lacked impact, but because she no longer interpreted it the same way. What once felt like humiliation now felt like confirmation. Confirmation of how he saw her. Confirmation of how the system defined her. Confirmation of everything she had begun to understand. And instead of breaking under it, she saw through it. That was a shift. Not emotional, not reactive, structural. Because fear depends on perception. And once perception changes, fear loses its foundation. For a brief moment, her mind pulled backward, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. Memories surfaced, not as distractions, but as reference points. The years of quiet endurance, the compromises she had made, the identity she had slowly allowed herself to lose in exchange for stability. All of it aligned now, not as separate experiences, but as part of the same pattern. Every moment she had accepted less. Every time she had remained silent. Every decision she had justified as necessary. It had not just shaped her, it had trained her. The realization landed with a force that was not emotional, but intellectual, and it changed everything. Because understanding the purpose of something gives you the power to reject it. For the first time, Illyra did not see herself as someone who had survived her circumstances. She saw herself as someone who had been conditioned by them. And conditioning, once recognized, can be broken. That was the moment fear lost its control. Not gradually, not partially, completely, because fear requires uncertainty. And she was no longer uncertain. She knew what he was. She knew what the system was. And most importantly, she knew what she was within it. Not powerless, not insignificant, but positioned. And positioning, when understood, becomes opportunity. The shift inside her was not dramatic. It did not manifest outwardly in visible defiance or sudden resistance. That would have been reckless. That would have exposed her before she was ready. Instead, it settled into something far more dangerous. Control, not over him, not over the system, but over herself. Her thoughts aligned, her focus sharpened. The emotional weight that had once clouded her perception dissolved, replaced by clarity so precise it felt almost attached. This was no longer about endurance. It was about direction. And direction required decision. Illyra stepped away from the moment, as she always did, quietly, without disruption, without drawing attention. But internally, she was no longer the same person who had entered it. because this time she did not carry the weight of what had happened. She carried the understanding of why it had happened, and that made all the difference. The memories that followed were no longer painful. They were instructive. Every sacrifice she had made, every part of herself she had suppressed, every moment she had accepted less than she deserved, it all formed a pattern she could now see clearly. And within that pattern, she found something she had not expected. Strength, not the kind that resists openly, but the kind that endures long enough to understand. And once understanding is complete, it transforms into something else, something far more powerful. Purpose. A single thought formed, clear, steady, and irreversible. She would not remain in this position, not because she wanted to escape, but because she understood it. And understanding removes the illusion of inevitability. For the first time, Elara considered possibilities she had never allowed herself to think before. Not survival, not escape, confrontation. The idea did not come with fear. It came with structure, because confrontation in a system like Adrian's could not be emotional. It could not be impulsive. It had to be precise, controlled, and aligned with the very structure she intended to challenge. Otherwise, it would fail. And failure at this level was not an option. She began to think differently, not as someone inside the system, but as someone analyzing it from within, identifying points of pressure, moments of vulnerability, areas where control relied too heavily on assumption. Because every system, no matter how refined, has limits, and limits, once identified, can be used. Elara did not rush the process. She allowed her thoughts to develop fully, to connect, to align with the patterns she had already uncovered. Every conclusion was tested, every assumption examined, every possibility measured against the structure she now understood. It was not planning, not yet. It was preparation, because before you act against control, you must understand it completely. And she was close, closer than she had ever been. The emotional transformation that followed was quiet, but absolute. The fear that had once defined her responses no longer existed in the same way. In its place was something far more stable. Confidence, not in the outcome, but in the process. Because for the first time, she was not reacting to circumstances. She was preparing to influence them. And that shift marked a point of no return. There was no going back to silence, no returning to passive acceptance, no pretending that she did not see what she now understood. Because awareness, once complete, demands action, even if that action is delayed, even if it is hidden, even if it is dangerous. Elara stood at the edge of that realization, fully aware of what it meant, not just for her, but for everything connected to Adrian's world. Because confronting him was not just confronting a man, it was confronting a system that had been built to prevent exactly that, which meant her approach could not be direct. It could not be obvious. It had to be something else, something unexpected, something that did not challenge the system from the outside, but from within. The thought settled into place with quiet certainty, and once it did, everything else began to align around it. The patterns she had observed, the connections she had uncovered, the weaknesses she had identified, all of it began to form something coherent, something structured, something actionable. It was no longer a question of whether she would act. It was a question of how. And as that clarity reached its peak, one final realization emerged, one that defined everything that would come next. She was not trying to escape him. She was preparing to face him, directly, completely, and on her own terms. The shift was complete. The fear was gone. And in its place stood something far more dangerous. Intent. She finalizes a plan, not to escape, but to confront. The truth didn't just expose him. It stripped away the control he built his entire life on. By the time Elara reached this moment, nothing about her felt uncertain. The plan had not been created in haste. It had not been driven by anger or desperation or even revenge. It had been constructed slowly, piece by piece, aligned with the same precision that defined Adrian's world. Because to confront a system built on control, you must understand it well enough to break it. And she did. The setting had been chosen carefully, not random, not convenient, strategic, a high-stakes environment where influence concentrated naturally, where decisions carried weight, where reputations mattered, and where visibility could not be avoided. It was the kind of place Adrian thrived in, the kind of place where his authority felt absolute, which made it the only place where it could truly be challenged. Everything around her reflected the same controlled elegance she had seen before: structured interactions, calculated movements, conversations layered with intention. But this time, she was not observing it from the outside. She was stepping into it with purpose. Illyra moved through the environment with quiet precision, no hesitation, no visible tension. Her composure was complete, not as a mask, but as a reflection of her clarity. Every step she took was aligned with a decision she had already made. There was no uncertainty left, because uncertainty had been replaced by understanding, and understanding had been replaced by action. Adrian was exactly where he was expected to be, at the center, surrounded by influence, attention, and the quiet acknowledgement of power that followed him wherever he stood. His presence remained unchanged, controlled, composed, untouchable. To everyone else, nothing was different, but Illyra saw it clearly. The system around him was still intact, but it was about to be disrupted, not by force, not by chaos, but by truth. The approach was not dramatic. She did not interrupt. She did not announce herself. She entered a space the same way she always had, quietly, precisely, without demanding attention. But this time, her presence carried something different, intent, and he felt it, not immediately, not consciously, but instinctively. Adrian's awareness shifted the moment she entered his proximity. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but real. His attention adjusted, recalibrating in a way that suggested recognition of something he could not yet define, because for the first time, she was not predictable. Illyra did not wait. She did not hesitate. The moment she had prepared for her, the moment she had aligned everything toward, arrived without resistance, and she stepped into it completely. The truth was not presented as an accusation. It was not framed as an attack. It was delivered as structure, precise, controlled, unavoidable. The information she revealed did not rely on emotion. It did not require interpretation. It was built on patterns, connections, and undeniable alignment. Everything she had uncovered, everything she had understood, everything she had pieced together from the system he believed was unbreakable. His past, his manipulations, the way his empire had not just grown, but had been engineered through calculated positioning, including hers. The way her life had been influenced long before she ever entered his world. It was all there, not as scattered claims, but as a complete structure. And once presented, it could not be dismissed. That was the moment everything changed. Not outwardly, not immediately, but internally, because control, when challenged by truth, does not collapse all at once. It fractures. Adrian's reaction did not begin with anger. It began with stillness. A pause, so precise it felt unnatural. His expression did not shift dramatically. His posture remained composed. His presence, at least on the surface, did not break, but something beneath it moved. For the first time, his control was not absolute. The realization passed through him in silence, but its impact was immediate. His awareness sharpened not outwardly, but inwardly, recalculating, reassessing, attempting to contain what had just been introduced into his system. Because what Illyra had revealed was not just information. It was exposure, and exposure in a system built on control is destabilizing. The people around them did not fully understand what was happening. Not yet, but they felt it. The shift in tension, the subtle imbalance, the way the space between them had changed, because power, even when silent, has a presence. And for the first time, Adrian's presence was not completely stable. Illyra remained still, not passive, not waiting, but grounded. Her control did not come from dominance. It came from certainty. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to demand acknowledgement, because the truth, once revealed, carries its own weight, and that weight was already settling into the space around them. Adrian's response came next, not emotional, not explosive, but controlled, at least at first. He adjusted, subtly, precisely, attempting to reestablish the balance that had just been disrupted. His attention narrowed, focusing entirely on her now, analyzing, measuring, searching for weakness in what she had presented, because that was how he operated. He did not react. He corrected. But this time, there was nothing to correct, because the structure she had revealed was complete, and completeness leaves no room for dismissal. The shift happened slowly, but undeniably. His control began to slip, not visibly at first, but internally. The precision that defined him started to fracture under the weight of something he had not accounted for. Not resistance, not opposition, but understanding, because Alara had not challenged his system from the outside. She had understood it from within, and that made her impossible to predict. For the first time, Adrian was not ahead. He was reacting. The change in dynamic was subtle, but absolute. The balance of control, once entirely his, began to shift, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. Enough to create instability, enough to introduce uncertainty, enough to force him into a position he had not occupied in a very long time. Vulnerability. It showed in the smallest ways. A delay in response, a slight tightening of posture, a moment where his focus did not align perfectly with the situation. To anyone else, it might have gone unnoticed, but to Alara, it was unmistakable, because she had studied him long enough to recognize the absence of perfection. And now, for the first time, it was gone. The reaction that followed was inevitable. Control, when threatened, seeks to reassert itself. But without stability, that process becomes flawed. And flaws lead to exposure. The shift in him became sharper, more visible. His composure, while still present, no longer felt complete. There was something beneath it now, something less controlled, less calculated, more immediate. Emotion, not fully expressed, but present. And that alone was enough to confirm what Alara already knew. He had not anticipated this. Not the truth. Not her. Not the way she had approached it. And that lack of anticipation had cost him control. The roles had reversed. Not entirely. Not permanently. But in this moment, she was no longer the one being defined. He was, and the system that had once supported him now struggled to contain the shift. Because systems, no matter how strong, are only as stable as the control that maintains them. And his control was no longer absolute. Alara did not push further. She did not need to. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had exposed. It had destabilized. It had shifted the balance. Anything more would have been unnecessary, because this moment was not about destruction. It was about revelation, and that had already been achieved. But as the tension settled into a new, unstable equilibrium, something unexpected emerged. Something subtle. Something that did not align with the rest of the reaction. Because within Adrian's response, within the cracks in his control, within the instability that had begun to surface, there was something else. Something that did not fit. Not denial. Not anger. Not even resistance. But recognition. It was brief. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. And it didn't make sense. Because the truth she had revealed should have destabilized him completely. It should have created confusion, defensiveness, disruption. But instead, there was a moment, a single, controlled, undeniable moment, where his reaction suggested something else entirely, as if part of this was not new to him. The realization formed instantly, sharp, unsettling, and impossible to ignore, because if even a part of this truth was not unexpected, then something was missing, something she had not yet seen. And as that thought settled into place, cutting to the chaos of everything she had just set into motion, one final understanding emerged. Quiet, precise, and deeply unsettling. Even in chaos, there's something in his reaction that doesn't fully make sense. When everything collapsed, the only thing left standing was the truth she fought to uncover. The aftermath did not arrive with noise. There was no single moment where everything visibly broke apart. No dramatic collapse. No immediate unraveling of the system Adrian Voss had spent years constructing. Instead, the shift spread quietly, like a fracture beneath the surface, moving outward, weakening structure without announcing itself. That was how control ended, not with destruction, but with instability. The event that had exposed him did not fade. It echoed, not loudly, not publicly at first, but within the circles that mattered, the kind of environments where perception shaped reality, and where even the smallest disruption in control carried consequences. Questions began to form, not openly, not directly, but persistently. Patterns that had once gone unquestioned were now re-examined. Decisions that had been accepted without hesitation were now viewed with caution. The consistency that had defined his empire, the precision, the predictability, the absence of visible flaws, no longer felt absolute. And once doubt enters a system built on control, it does not leave. Adrian's world did not collapse overnight, but it began to shift. Subtly, irreversibly, influence, once unquestioned, became conditional. Partnerships, once stable, required reassessment. Trust, once assumed, demanded verification. The structure remained intact, but its foundation had changed. Because control relies on perception, and perception had been altered, Alara observed it from a distance, not as someone involved, not as someone affected, but as someone who understood. For the first time, she was not inside the system. She was outside of it, and that difference changed everything. The transition did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet. There was no defining moment where she declared herself free, no visible separation that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Instead, the shift happened internally, gradually but completely. The weight she had carried for so long was gone, not because her past had changed, but because her understanding of it had. That was the transformation, not external, but structural. She no longer saw herself as someone shaped by circumstance. She saw herself as someone who had understood it. And understanding creates distance. Distance from fear, distance from control, distance from the identity that had once been imposed on her. For the first time in a long time, her thoughts were not defined by reaction. They were not shaped by limitation or expectation or survival. They moved freely, unrestricted by the system she had once existed within. And within that freedom, she began to recognize herself again. Not the version she had been before everything changed, but something else, something stronger, more precise, more aware, because she had not simply returned to who she was. She had evolved beyond it. The memories of her past no longer carried the same weight. They did not disappear, but they transformed. What had once felt like loss now felt like context. What had once felt like pain now felt like information. Every moment she had endured, every sacrifice she had made, every part of herself she had been forced to suppress, it all led here, not as justification, but as foundation. And for the first time, that foundation felt stable. But closure, she realized, is not always complete. Because even as everything around Adrian's world continued to shift, even as his control weakened, his influence fractured, and his system struggled to maintain its structure, there was something that did not align, something that remained unresolved. The moment from before, his reaction, it lingered in her mind, not as confusion, but as a question that refused to settle. Because everything that followed made sense. The exposure, the destabilization, the shift in power, all of it aligned with what she had expected, except for that one detail, that moment of recognition. It did not fit, and the more she thought about it, the more significant it became, because recognition suggests awareness, and awareness, in this context, suggested something far more complex than she had initially understood. It suggested that part of the truth she had revealed was not new to him. The thought did not disturb her, but it did not leave her either, because if there was something he already knew, then there was something she didn't, and that meant the story was not complete. Alara did not act on the thought immediately. She did not return to investigation. She did not attempt to re-enter the system she had just stepped out of, because for the first time, she allowed herself something she had not experienced in a long time. Stillness, not the kind forced by control, but the kind chosen through clarity. She allowed the space to exist, allowed the silence to settle, allowed herself to exist without purpose, without strategy, without the constant need to analyze or anticipate. And within that stillness, something unexpected emerged. Peace, not perfect, not permanent, but real, because for the first time, She was not reacting to a system that defined her. She was existing independently of it. And that independence was something she had never truly known before. The world around her felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The structures that once felt overwhelming now appeared distant. The pressure that once shaped her decisions no longer existed in the same way. She was no longer inside it, and that made all the difference. But clarity does not erase curiosity, and truth, once uncovered, does not remain incomplete without consequence. The question returned, quiet, persistent, unresolved. Why had he reacted that way? The more she considered it, the less it felt like a detail, and the more it felt like a missing piece. Something essential, something that could reshape everything she thought she understood. Because if Adrian had known part of the truth, then the system she had uncovered was not just complex. It was layered, and layers, by nature, hide more than they reveal. The realization did not pull her back immediately, but it remained, waiting. Because some truths do not end when they're revealed. They expand, and expansion demands continuation. Alara stood at the edge of that understanding, fully aware of what it meant, not as someone trapped within a system, but as someone who had stepped beyond it. She was no longer controlled, no longer defined, no longer limited by the structure that had once shaped her life. She had faced it, understood it, broken it, and walked away from it. But as she looked forward, into a future no longer dictated by someone else's design, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable. Not everything had been uncovered, not everything had been explained, and not everything had ended, because truth, in its fullest form, is never singular. It is layered, expanding, persistent, and sometimes unfinished. Even after everything ends, some truths refuse to stay buried. The moment she stopped reacting, he started paying attention. Awareness changes behavior, but controlled awareness changes everything. Alara did not make the mistake of acting differently in obvious ways. She understood too well that sudden shifts invited attention, and attention, in Adrian's world, was never neutral. Instead, her transformation unfolded with precision, subtle enough to remain undetected at first, but intentional enough to reshape her position within the system. She became quieter, not in the way she had been before, silent out of necessity, restrained by circumstance, but quieter with purpose. Her stillness was no longer passive. It was active, observant, focused. Every movement around her became data. Every interaction, a pattern. Every silence, an opportunity to listen more closely. It was not something others would immediately recognize. To most, she appeared unchanged, composed, controlled, existing within the same boundaries she always had. But beneath that surface, something had shifted fundamentally. She was no longer absorbing the system. She was studying it, and that shift, no matter how carefully concealed, created imbalance. Because systems built on control rely on predictability, and Alara was no longer predictable. At first, the change went unnoticed. Adrian's world was too vast, too structured, too efficient to react to minor deviations. His systems were designed to filter noise, to ignore anything that did not pose immediate disruption. And Alara, despite her growing awareness, remained subtle enough to exist within those margins. But predictability, once altered, leaves traces. And Adrian noticed traces. It did not happen instantly. It never did with him. His awareness operated differently, slower, more deliberate, but far more accurate. He did not react to isolated events. He observed patterns over time, allowing inconsistencies to reveal themselves before he acted. And Alara, despite her precision, had begun to create inconsistencies, small ones, barely visible, but enough. The first shift he noticed was not in her actions, but in her absence of reaction. Situations that once produced subtle emotional responses, tension, hesitation, controlled discomfort, no longer did. She remained composed in moments where slight disruption would have been expected. It was not dramatic, but it was different. And difference in Adrian's world required attention. His focus did not turn toward her completely. Not yet, but it adjusted. Quietly, almost imperceptibly. Systems that once operated around her, without scrutiny, began to include her within their range. Not aggressively, not directly, but intentionally. Illyria felt it before she saw it. The subtle tightening of her environment, the way access points shifted slightly, the way certain interactions became more controlled, more measured. It was not restriction, but it was observation. And observation meant one thing. She had been noticed. The realization did not alarm her. It clarified her position, because awareness works both ways. If he was beginning to observe her, then she could observe him observing her. And that created something new. A balance, not of power, but of attention. The space between them changed after that. There were no confrontations, no direct acknowledgments, no visible signs that anything had shifted. But beneath the surface, something had begun, a silent exchange that neither of them addressed, but both of them understood. A game, not one defined by rules or objectives, but by perception. Who could see more? Who could understand faster? Who could act without revealing intent? Illyria adjusted again, not by retreating, but by refining. She reduced unnecessary movement, limited her focus, became even more precise in what she observed and what she ignored. Every action she took served a purpose, even if that purpose was to appear unchanged. Because in a system like Adrian's, visibility was vulnerability, and invisibility, when controlled, became power. At the same time, Adrian's presence shifted in ways that were difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. He did not increase his involvement with her directly. He did not question her, confront her, or restrict her more openly. Instead, he allowed the system to respond, which meant the pressure came indirectly. Information around her became slightly less accessible, not removed, but delayed. Interactions she once moved through easily now require more effort, more timing, more awareness. Nothing was denied outright, but everything required more precision. It was a test, not of her actions, but of her awareness. And Illyria understood it, because she was doing the same thing. The dynamic between them evolved into something far more complex than control. It became observation layered over observation, intention concealed beneath behavior, strategy hidden within routine. They were no longer operating within the same system. They were operating within each other's awareness of that system. And that made every moment significant. Every detail mattered. Every silence carried weight. Because silence, in this context, was no longer absence. It was communication. There were moments, brief, controlled, almost invisible, where their awareness intersected. Not directly, not openly, but enough to confirm what both of them already knew. Something had changed, and neither of them intended to be the first to expose it. But control, even at this level, is never absolute, because systems, no matter how precise, rely on timing. And timing can shift. The first real disruption came unexpectedly. It was subtle, almost insignificant on the surface. A delay in a scheduled process. A minor inconsistency in data flow. Nothing that would normally attract attention. But within the current context, it carried weight, because it did not align. Illyria noticed it immediately, not because it was obvious, but because it interrupted a pattern she had been tracking. A sequence that had remained consistent until that moment. And now, for the first time, it had changed. The shift was small, but it was enough. She followed it carefully, tracing the disruption backward instead of forward, not reacting, not adjusting, just observing where the inconsistency originated. And what she found was unexpected, because the disruption did not come from within the system. It came from outside it. That realization altered everything. Up until now, her understanding had been contained within Adrian's world, his structure, his control, his design. But this suggested something beyond that, something external, something not fully contained. The thought alone introduced a new variable, and variables in a controlled system are dangerous. Illyria did not act on it immediately. She held the information, allowing it to settle, to connect, to reveal its significance over time, because reacting too quickly would disrupt the balance she had carefully maintained. But the knowledge changed her approach, because now she was no longer just observing Adrian's system. She was observing its limitations. And limitations meant vulnerability. At the same time, Adrian's attention sharpened. The disruption, though minor, had not gone unnoticed by him either. His systems were designed to detect inconsistency, no matter how small. And once detected, they adjusted, tightening, refining, correcting, which meant his awareness was no longer passive. It was active, and it was narrowing toward her. The pressure increased, not visibly, but structurally. Access became more controlled. Timing became more critical. The margins within which he operated grew smaller, more defined. He was getting closer, not to the full truth, but to the awareness that she was moving toward it. And in a system like his, that alone was enough to trigger response. Illyra recognized it immediately. The shift was too precise to ignore. He was no longer observing patterns. He was isolating variables. And she was one of them. For the first time since the silent game began, the balance tilted. Slightly, but enough. Because proximity to discovery changes everything. It accelerates decisions. It forces movement. It reduces the space available for strategy. And Illyra knew she was approaching that point. But just as the pressure reached its peak, just as Adrian's systems aligned closely enough to begin revealing her direction, something unexpected happened. The disruption she had noticed earlier expanded. What had started as a minor inconsistency grew into something larger. Not chaotic, not uncontrolled, but significant enough to redirect attention. Systems that had been narrowing toward her suddenly shifted outward, responding to something beyond their original focus. It was not random. It was not accidental. But it was enough. Enough to delay him. Enough to create space. Enough to break the immediate trajectory that had been leading directly toward her. Illyra did not understand the full cause. Not yet, but she understood the impact. The game had not ended, but it had changed. Because now, there was something else in play. Something neither of them had fully accounted for. And as the system adjusted, recalibrated, and redirected its focus, one truth became clear, sharp, immediate, and impossible to ignore. He gets dangerously close to discovering her truth. But something unexpected delays him.